Hi everyone, Hilton Forrester here on the Hilton Forrester Show. Welcome to another episode. On this episode, I've got Matty Dalrymple here with me, and she's an author and another podcaster. And we're going to talk about the behind the scenes with the podcasting, and it's going to be chunks and chunks of things to do with your content. So welcome to the call, Matty.
Thank you. It's very exciting to be here.
Okay, great. So my first question, Matty, just tell the listeners a bit more about you and how you got to this position in your business and where you are.
Well, my first foray into the writing and publishing world was as a suspense author. And in 2013, I published my first suspense novel, the first Anne Kinnear suspense novel, The Sense of Death, and published subsequently two more installments of the Anne Kinnear story, The Sense of Reckoning and The Falcon and the Owl. And I have the fourth installment coming out probably in April.
Okay.
And then I'm also the author of the Lizzie Ballard thriller series, Rock, Paper, Scissors, Snakes and Ladders, and The Iron Ring. And somewhere along that author journey, I was a member of a local writers group and tapping into that group for expertise when I would hit questions in my own writing or indie publishing career. And I got very intrigued about the idea of sharing out that knowledge with other people. And so back in 2016, I think I was doing very occasional podcasting as the Indie author, INDY, which is my nonfiction platform.
Yeah.
And I was working a full-time job at the time, so the episodes were pretty sporadic. They were really triggered by me either having a specific question and going and finding someone locally who could answer it for me, or me hearing about somebody's expertise and thinking that would be an interesting thing to talk with them about. And so I had, periodic episodes through 2016, through 2019. And then in 2019, I left my corporate job and I got much more regular and serious about the podcast. And then later in 2019, I went weekly. So since that time, I've been putting out weekly podcast episodes about the writing craft and the publishing voyage, as I like to say.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's wonderful. So when it comes to podcasting, when you started podcasting, what do you think, say if someone's now wanting to start podcasting and they want to, say, make it as a business or a living, what are the ways they can actually do that now?
Well, in the book I have about this called The Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, I talk first about what a person's goals are. Yeah. So originally for me, my goal for my podcast was just to be able to network with people. And then as time went on, and especially when I left my corporate job and I was making a go of making my living through my various streams of income, I'm a big fan of the concept of multiple streams of income if you're a creator.
Yeah.
And so I still wanted to network. I still wanted to be able to share the information that I gathered out to other authors, indie and traditional, but I wanted to monetize the podcast as well. And so there are several ways you can monetize a podcast. You can get sponsorships.
Okay.
I've just started in on that. I think you have to have, quite a track record and a good history of listenership and downloads in order to attract sponsors. You can also make money through affiliates. So if, let's say you're doing a podcast on, I'll use this example because it just came up. A couple of months ago, I talked with Mark Leslie Lefebvre, who is the director of business development at Drafted Digital. I hope I'm getting Mark's title right. And he had a book that just came out called Wide for the Win, meaning the benefits of publishing beyond just Amazon for people who are in the indie author community. And so this specific example wasn't a podcast example, but it easily could be to say, you guys may have remembered my conversation with Mark Lefebvre in episode whatever on going wide. And if you go to my website or in this podcast link, you can buy a copy of his book through an affiliate link that earns money through Amazon. So affiliate income is another way people can make money through a podcast. And the other way I would say is sponsorships.
Yeah.
So many of you may have heard, or Hilton, you may be using Patreon.
Yeah.
And Patreon is a membership platform, so that if people become regular listeners to a podcast, they can pledge a small or a large amount of money a month. But I think Patreon generally assumes you're going to get many patrons pledging relatively small amounts of money. So I have a Patreon account. People who follow the podcast, some of them pledge $3 a month. That's my standard rate.
Okay.
And that also is something that builds up very much over time. And the final thing I'll mention in terms of monetizing is something like Buy Me a Coffee. So Buy Me a Coffee is similar to Patreon in the sense that it gives people who are consuming your content a way to pay you back, literally, for that value. And I think that both Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee offer both of these flavors, but I like separating them out and having Patreon be the ongoing monthly sort of subscription membership.
Yeah.
Buy Me a Coffee is something that I position as, if you found particular value from an episode or a resource on my website, then you can buy me a virtual coffee. And a virtual coffee is $3. So people could buy you one coffee, or they could buy you 5 coffees if they were really taken with it. And I think that that's really a great direction for creators to go, because I think that there's more and more a recognition that although people can get lots of useful information for free on the internet, there's a growing understanding that it kind of makes sense to compensate the creator of that content through something like Buy Me a Coffee. So if people are looking at podcasting as strictly a business money-making venture, then those are some options. But I always have to caution that it is the marathon, not a sprint. And it takes years, I would say, years in order to build up a listenership and a network that would enable that to be a significant source of income.
Yeah, that is good. I can see why that would happen, as you mentioned about your content and connecting to others. But when it comes to, for instance, you do a podcast, what are the ways you can actually use that content over and over again?
Yeah, that is something that I feel so strongly about, and I'm trying to figure out how I can work this into a book-length piece of information. But I'll use my own story as an example of the learning I had. And that is that early on, when I would have a podcast episode, I would, I would find the guest, and I would pitch them being a guest on my podcast. I would interview them. And at the time, I was doing my interviews live, so there were logistical challenges. I would record the podcast, then I would edit it. It was a lot of work. And I would put the podcast episode up, and I would say on my social media platforms and my email newsletter, here's the podcast. And then that was it. I was on to the next podcast episode. And I finally realized that that is such an undervaluing way of treating your own content and treating the content of your guest. And so I use the term value intentionally because I think it implies both the value, the potential monetary or networking or expertise establishing value, but the idea of showing esteem, respecting the time and effort that your guest has put into it if you have a podcast that has a guest on it. So now what I do is I make the most possible use I can of the content that I get from the podcast. And for me, it's pretty easy because most of my content is evergreen. I'm not talking about things that change quickly over time, like how to succeed at Facebook ads or something like that. I'm talking about things like how to handle backstory in fiction, or the benefits of not putting all your eggs in one retailer basket. That's going to be just as valid in a year or 2 years as it is when I first put it out. And so when I do a podcast episode, I do that initial, here's the new episode promotion. But I also, for the following week, I clip out excerpts from the interview.
Yes.
And I put one up every day, and linking them back to my podcast page where they can listen to the entire episode. And just as importantly, calling out the guest by their social media account in each of those. So they see that they're getting this daily exposure for the week following. And then ongoing, I also started something I called classic clips.
Right.
So in one day, I might have, let's say it's a Friday, and my episodes normally go out on Tuesdays. So on Friday, I would be posting the excerpt of that Tuesday episode, but I also post the classic clip. And ideally, I can often find a previous episode where the guest talked about something that was tied in some way to the clip that I've posted from that week's episode. Or even if I can't, I just find something that I think is still useful and put it up. And so months later, that same guest is saying, oh, look, I'm still getting love. I'm still getting love from the Indie Author Podcast because they invested an hour and a half, however long we spent. And they like to see that content is being used to its fullest.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. I mean, I think that is so true. But when you're actually finding these platforms, like you've got the Facebook, you've got the Twitter, you've got the Instagram, you've so many different ones. How do you actually deal with that side of it? How do you deal with the platforms?
Yeah, the other thing that I want to write a book about someday is the idea of narrowing your focus.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to try all sorts of different platforms because you never know what's going to work for you until you try them.
Right.
Like Instagram, for example. I have an Instagram account, and if people go to Matty Dalrymple on Instagram, they will see pictures of flowers and my dogs. Like, I don't use it for promotion at all because I like looking at the pictures on Instagram, but that's the only thing I do as a user. It never gripped me as something I go to all the time. And so it kind of didn't make sense for me to try to have a professional platform on Instagram. And I've tried others as well. Pinterest, that didn't grab me. And I'm really focusing on Facebook.
Okay.
And I kind of do Twitter because I feel as if you're a nonfiction author, Twitter is a better nonfiction platform, in my opinion, than it is for fiction authors. And I kind of do it because I feel like I have to. But contrary to the example I was using earlier about going wide, I think in this case, focus is really important. And I'm actually getting a little uncomfortable because I have so many of my eggs in the Facebook basket now that from a business point of view, I'm a little uncomfortable about it. And I'm trying to expand out again.
Yes.
But I think that it's really a mistake to try to do all platforms, especially in social media. Pick the couple that you enjoy doing, because if you enjoy doing it, you'll stick with it and you'll have a more engaging presence. If you're just doing it because you have to, you're not really going to grab people.
I see. Yeah, that is so true. So when it comes to the content, for instance, I do a podcast here with yourself, and I could actually take it and turn it into Audible. I can do the YouTube. Do you ever move towards the YouTube side?
I do. I have. It's mainly episodes from the podcast. Occasionally, if there, if this goes up on YouTube, then I would share it on my channel. So there's some content where I've been a guest on something, or I've done a reading or a talk somewhere that was recorded, and I'll put that up if that's available for me to share that way. But I do put up episodes, the interview portion of the podcast episodes on YouTube, and but I mainly use the video for promotional purposes because it's another one of those things. People assure me that folks are listening to content on YouTube, and I just can't quite get it. So I have the video anyway because I record video when I'm doing a podcast interview, but I'm mainly using that to create excerpts to put on social media, because on social media like Facebook and Twitter, I think video is much more eye-catching than just a post with a URL in it. But then I have the video, so why not? It takes me an extra 3 minutes to put it up on YouTube. So in that case, it is worth the little bit of extra time to get it out on a platform that's as popular as YouTube is.
Okay, awesome. I want to just take you back into your past now, Matty, when you was working in corporate before, and then you're an entrepreneur now. You know, that journey to go from actually working to being a business owner. Could you explain how that went for you and why you really arrived at this point?
Yeah, so I spent several decades in the business world, mainly as a project manager.
Okay.
And that experience has proven so helpful to me in my indie and publishing journey, because it's given me a great business foundation. It's given me, an appreciation of contract language, an appreciation of schedules, an appreciation of task management and communications approaches and things like that. Everything that I did in my corporate life, I've been able to bake into my business. And the other huge benefit that has given me is that in 2019, the company I belonged to was restructuring, and they eliminated the position I was in, and they gave me a choice of applying for a different position or taking a severance package. And I decided to take the severance package.
Wow.
And so that was great because I had some severance benefits coming, but maybe more importantly, I'd spent several decades putting money away. At the time, I was thinking for retirement, but I had accumulated enough of a nest egg that I didn't have to feel as if, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to pay the rent or pay the mortgage or pay the electric bill unless I sell 100 books this month.
Yeah.
Because it is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so it was great for me to be able to go to my financial planning guy and say, I'm going to have to start tapping into the money that I had originally planned for my retirement now. And he actually, he buys into this, which I was happy to hear. It means that as time goes on, and now, right now I have 6 novels and a number of short stories and 2 nonfiction books out. In 10 years, one hopes I've doubled that number.
Yeah.
And so those are all just going to be continuing streams of income for me. In 10 years, I'm probably still going to be doing the podcast, and I will have more patrons and more people buying me virtual coffees. And, I will have built that up over time. So in that time in the future, when I otherwise would have been having to tap into my savings,
Yeah.
I now won't need it anymore because, I've used it early so that it will pay me back later. So I actually have a podcast episode. The podcast episode that's going up tomorrow is with a woman named M.K. Williams. And it was funny talking to her because she and I have almost identical professional backgrounds. She came from the corporate background, similar kind of project management, and is now doing somewhat similar things to what I'm doing in the indie publishing world. And she has some really great perspectives on how should you approach it if you know that in a year or 5 years or whatever, you want to leave your corporate day job and you want to make a go of it as an indie author. What happens if you've just lost your job and now you're looking for a way to make money? Really great advice on that. So if people are interested in delving into that in more detail, I can highly recommend the M.K. Williams episode.
Okay, awesome. What I want to talk about, another question is, what that journey between corporate to where you are now, what are some of the mistakes you've made in terms of that?
Well, one thing, I'm going to start out with something that I learned that was really good while I think about the big mistakes question. The one thing that I learned that was really good is that I'll just say I'm never going to be able to work for someone else again. Because the huge benefit of setting your own schedule is, among other things, how you chunk your time.
Yeah.
And I look back to when I was in the corporate world, and the way I chunked my time was 15 minutes here and 7 minutes there and 34 minutes here. And it was always task switching.
Yeah.
And I remember years ago, I got certified as an Agile Scrum Master. So if there are folks in your audience who are like IT geeks, they'll know what I'm talking about.
I think.
And one of the exercises the instructor did about the dangers of task switching is that he was up at his whiteboard and he asked for a volunteer to come up and he said, okay, I want you to write the numbers. There are 3 columns. I want you to write the numbers 1 through 10 in Arabic numerals in the first column. I want you to write the numbers 1 through 10 in Roman numerals, and we'll help if you need help, in the second column. And then I want you to write A through whatever the 10th letter of the alphabet is in the third column. And we're going to time you. So the person was like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, A, B, C, D, and so on. And let's say it took him 30 seconds.
Okay.
And he said, okay, now I want you to do the same thing, but I want you to write an Arabic number 1 in the first column, a Roman numeral 1 in the second column, and A in the third column. Then I want you to write, Arabic to Roman to B. So at the end, you're going to have the same effect, but you need to be switching your mindset from Arabic numbers to Roman numbers to letters. And it took the person like 3 times as long.
Okay.
And it is totally true that penalty you pay for task switching makes a huge difference. And I feel like if I could go back and talk to the people who were, I was probably one of those people because I was project manager. I was probably part of the problem, but, let people focus on a task for longer than 13 minutes at a time.
Yeah.
So the fact that once I became a self-employed indie publisher, I could spend half a day on something. And that's kind of how I chunk out my day. I basically have half my day that I'm focusing on business, publishing, administrative related things, and about half the day when I'm spending on writing. And that was a huge benefit. But I have to say that, I was just so happy to be finally working for myself that it wasn't really traumatic. And in fact, here we are in March 2021, still in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And I have to say that when the lockdown happened, pretty much a year ago, it wasn't that much of a difference for me because, I had become so used to the remote working scenario that I was able to just roll right along. But I think that a lot of people really struggle with the scheduling aspect of making that change, that their life has been very scheduled and structured in a corporate environment, and that they have to find ways of creating a self-beneficial scenario to replace that schedule when they become self-employed.
I greatly appreciate it. That's a great answer. I think also what I'm hearing as well, that cushion where you've got your corporate background, and you then have your situation with your finances as well. But if someone's starting out now from business with no money, what advice would you actually give them to go forward?
Well, I think it depends on where their interests lie. For example, I took a course last year called the 6-Figure Author Marketing Challenge. It was with Nicholas Eric and Lisa Vino. I can highly, highly recommend it. And one of the things they did, although I don't think that they do this anymore, but at the time that I took the class, you put together a business plan and then they reviewed each person's business plan individually. And so at the time, my stretch goal, I'll say from my corporate background, is that I had been on a more or less once a year. I had gotten to about a once a year schedule with my novels while I was still working. My first novels were more like once every 2 years. And then I got more efficient and I was on about a 1 a year schedule. And then when I was doing it full time, my goal was two fiction books a year, 2 nonfiction books a year.
Yeah.
And it was a little bit of a cheat for this year because I kind of had a novel banked, but I was still planning on trying to hit that 4 books a year schedule. And they both said, if money is your goal, then focus on the fiction and focus on series.
Yes.
Again, this is not helping someone who loses their job today and has to pay the rent next week. I don't know that there's a good answer for that other than trying to find a new job that is going to move you in the direction that you want to go. Like, let's say you want to get into India publishing, but long term you want to spin up an editing career.
Okay.
So looking for a job that would enable you to pay the bills in the editing world, or offering editing services might be a way to do that.
Yes.
But I think in general, their advice was fiction in a series is probably the most financially profitable route you can take, genre fiction in a series. And I would also say that, and I'm kind of saying this anecdotally, not because I have hard data on it, but that if you're writing nonfiction, then you should consider it as part of a larger suite of offerings. So don't expect that you're going to be making a ton of money off your books, but maybe the book is an entree to speaking engagements, or maybe the book is an entree to a consulting engagement. So looking at not the one product that you may be thinking of in the front of your mind is what you want to offer, but all the things around that you could build a business around, and always thinking in
Yes.
terms of multiple streams of income. So if one starts to dry up a bit, you have other ones to fall back on.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned the multiple sources of income. That's basically, would you advise someone to keep in the same area? Because you're pretty much in the same area. You do podcasting, you're an author, you do speaking. Generally, that's all in the same pot. So one connects to the other. What advice would you give for that?
If you can do that, I think it's great, because it does feed each other in a nice way. It's sort of a virtuous cycle of information and learning. So when I interview someone on the Indie Author podcast, I can often apply that information to my the fiction side of my business. I think the more closely it's tied together, the better. But again, people have to do what they have to do in order to put together a living wage. And so if you find that for a period of time you have to do something that's not really associated with your dream, the dream that you're driving for, then you need to do that, but recognize that it's hopefully a temporary situation that you're using to get you to that longer term goal.
Yeah, great. And as you're doing your writing, how do you get inspired to do certain? I've seen so many different books you've actually done. Where do you get your inspiration from?
Well, for the nonfiction books, the inspiration I got from my first nonfiction book, which was Taking the Short Tack, Creating Income and Connecting with Readers Using Short Fiction.
Yeah.
I had written a series of Ann Kinnear suspense shorts because I'd written 2 Ann Kinnear suspense novels. And then I had this idea that didn't really fit into the Ann Kinnear world. And I spun up what turned out to be another series. I didn't realize it at the time. I thought it was going to be a standalone book. And I told my Ann Kinnear fans, stand by. I'm going to be back with a novel right as soon as I'm done with this one. And then that turned out to be a trilogy. I wrote all 3 of those books over probably 3 years.
Yeah.
And at that point, I thought I really probably owe my Ann fans something. So I was writing some short stories, and I published them as standalone ebooks for 99 cents or 99p on Amazon and other online retailers. And I offered one to an anthology that was put out to support a local library. I had found a couple of things to do with them. I used one as a reader magnet to get people to sign up for my email newsletter. But then I kind of felt like there was more I could do with it. And I'm going to bring up Mark Leslie Lefebvre again. I listened to his podcast, Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing. And Mark had mentioned just in passing something about short fiction. And Mark has been a very successful short fiction author. So I wrote him a note. I'm a patron of his podcast. So as a patron, I wrote him a note and I said, I think you could have a whole podcast episode on this topic. Yeah. And he very graciously did. I think he called it 10 ways you can earn money with your short fiction, but he gave 13 because that's the kind of guy he is. And so then I got in touch with him and I said, I think this could be a book. Would you be interested in co-authoring a book with me? And he did. And that was Taking the Short Tack. So in that case, it was just having this very specific need and finding enough information that I thought I could share out with people as a book. And then the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, similarly, I was just collecting all this knowledge as I went ahead with a podcast. And I wasn't really seeing a lot out there that was specific to authors.
Yeah.
A lot of interest in podcasting, because as you probably know, it's a booming area, but not a lot specific to authors. So in the case of the fiction, it's just a topic that grabs my attention. And then I find myself accumulating enough information that I think it could serve as a book.
Yeah.
And then for the fiction, it's just really that having those what if ideas. The Anne Kinnear books are about a woman who can sense spirits and has sort of a business spun up around that. And that just came out of what if you were one of those people that report that they can see spirits? What would that be like? And so that's how that panned out. Lizzie Ballard similarly has another what if kind of ability that I can't really say because it would be a spoiler for the first book. But on the fiction side, it's really just having those what if questions drift into my mind.
And that's what inspires you.
Yeah.
Just to be creative all the time.
Yeah.
Do you ever get writer's block?
I don't get writer's block so much. And I think part of that is that I have other things that I can switch off to. So I know I could never get up in the morning, go downstairs, make a pot of coffee and sit down and write fiction for 8 hours. I just couldn't. I would just be staring at the screen for a lot of that time. I'm a kind of fiction writer who noodles in my mind. And then when I sit down, I can capture it quickly and have, sort of a solid first draft as a result of that. What I do find is that, and I've really found this with the fourth Anne Kinnear book that I'm just finishing up, that I found that the most efficient way for me to write is to write basically an outline and then go through that and flesh it out. So the first pass might be, Anne goes to Maine to film a documentary.
Right.
And then, similarly for the following steps. And then the second pass might be Anne goes to Maine with her brother Mike to film a documentary that her associate Garrick Mazur is also going to appear in, that's going to be on this topic. Like each pass gets more and more fleshed out until pretty soon I have a book. But what I found now is the finishing is very hard, because as I'm going through it, in order to keep up the momentum, if I get stuck on something, and it's usually something stupid like a word choice, I just skip past it and I make a note, come up with a better word here. But now I'm at that point where I can't skip over it anymore. And this is the most painful part, is going through and saying, I finally have to describe this restaurant, or I finally have to decide what fake name I'm going to give the restaurant or whatever. So that's sort of writer's blocky, but on a very small scale.
Okay, awesome. Would you say that you would aim towards being the best author or the bestseller of books?
Oh, isn't that an interesting question? Well, I would probably choose selling, because I think that if you're saying best, I don't, if I think of my favorite authors, I look at them and I say, you know what, I am probably never going to achieve that level of genius. But I'll put it this way, I'm more likely to do that if I'm in a situation where I'm selling enough books that I can continue doing this as my career.
Wow.
And I'm putting out solid craftsman-like work. And that's one of the reasons that I really like the nautical metaphor for writing, because I think that you have these people who are building, I don't know, the Queen Mary, think of the biggest, most elegant, fastest, whatever adjective you want to use, ships out there. And am I going to be that person? Probably not. But I went to and if you're thinking of that as like the best author, then maybe I'm never going to achieve that. But years ago, I went to a charitable event in Maine, and someone had donated a hand-built dory, and it was beautiful. It was small. It was very basic, but it was beautiful, beautifully finished,
Yeah.
beautiful wood. And that has really become my, like, the metaphor I want to use for my work. It's never going to be the Queen Mary. It's never going to be, the America's Cup sailing yacht, whatever they're called. But it is going to be a totally solid, waterproof piece of work. And I think that if I can produce those and then find the readers who are going to love them, then that's my goal as an author.
Beautiful. That's wonderful said. So you generally do Matty's best. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is good enough. Or you can only do your best, which is great. And if there was something you was actually telling people of the next generation who want to start to write books or do certain things, what you've accomplished, what would you advise them how to start and accomplish it?
I would say make sure that your goals are aligned with your actions. And so there are people who have one book, they write one book and they put it out there, and now they're hoping that they're going to be able to retire, and they're just not going to be able to. Like, even Stephen King is still cranking out however many books he writes. So if you have the book that you love in your heart and you want to get it out there, then you should do that, and you should adjust your expectations accordingly. That one book is not going to make you a career author. If you want to make a living at it, then don't expect to be able to put out a book every 5 years. If you want to develop a readership, then expect to have to put in a certain amount of time, effort, and investment. I'm a strong believer that you cannot edit your own work and you cannot make your own book covers. And so if you want to be professional about it, then you need to engage professionals who that's their job, to edit and to make book covers, to partner with you on getting it out there. So it's not that anyone, there are people who say, I've written this history of my family and I want all my relatives to be able to buy it in paperback. I'm going to put it out on Amazon as a paperback so that they can buy it. I have no objection to that whatsoever. But don't expect that you're ever going to sell more than 50 copies because, your goal was to write it for your family. So making sure that your expectations and your goals are aligned, and then being willing to step up to the actions you need to take in order to meet the goals.
Good. Okay, awesome. Are you a morning person or an evening or night?
I would say more of a morning person, although I do my administrative stuff in the morning. I've heard people say, find the time when you're most alert and do your most creative work then. But I've just found that the schedule that has worked for me is that I do the administrative stuff from about 8 to noon, and then have a break to eat something. And then at 1:00 every day, except for Fridays, 2 author friends and I get on Zoom and we sprint for an hour and a half. Okay. And when I first heard this was actually introduced to me by another guest of the Indie Author Podcast, Julie Duffy. And I can't remember the number of the episode, but it's Story a Day with Julie Duffy. And she had this organization called Story a Day, and she would host these Zoom sprints. And I said, a Zoom sprint? She said, yes. And I said, what are people doing? They're just writing? Yes, they're just writing. I was like, well, that's weird. And so Julie graciously opened up when the pandemic started, she opened up her group, which is normally a membership group, but she opened it up so other people could join it. I was like, I have to see what this is all about. And sure enough, they would get on, they'd chat for a few minutes, and then everybody would be quiet for like 20 minutes and write. And it was fantastic because you had to be there on time. You were committing to the other people in the group that, yes, you were writing. You weren't like checking your Facebook feed. And you were getting this support from the other people in the group. And so I convinced 2 of my author friends that this was a great idea. And so for probably a year now, we've been doing it every day except Friday. We'll write from 1 to 2:30, and then normally I continue on for a little while. So maybe I'm getting in 3 or 4 hours of fiction writing. And then in the evenings, I do whatever I have to do to meet the goals for that day. So the evening is kind of the grab bag.
That's a brilliant idea. And that is, it can be used universal into many different things.
Yeah.
You know,
especially if you're able to chunk your time up as you want to.
And especially on Zoom, where, everyone can do it connected from their home.
Yeah.
That's
Zoom has
awesome
been a
idea.
lifesaver. I think my husband and I have Zoom cocktails with our friends twice a week. So just nice to be able to reach out to people in some way during this odd time.
Yes, it's such a wonderful thing. Yes, and we're on Zoom now as well, which is incredible.
Yeah.
You're in the
It takes
US
away the
and I'm in
geographic boundaries.
Absolutely. Okay, great. So before I ask my last question, where can people find you online?
Well, if they're interested in my fiction, I can go to mattydalrymple.com. That's Matty with a Y, Matty, and Dalrymple with a Y. And if they're interested in my nonfiction platform, they can go to theindyauthor.com, and that's Indy with a Y. And then from there, they can find all my other social media platforms and so on.
Awesome. Great. If someone was who knew you all your life and they were actually talking about you, what would you want them to remember you as if it was actually just having a conversation with a friend about you?
Well, on the creative side, I hope they would remember me as that person who made the waterproof dory, the finely crafted waterproof dory. And then I also hope that they would think of me as someone who has found ways to pay it back to the author community through the podcast or blog posts or other resources I've provided. I benefited from the community, but I hope they would remember that I paid it forward to the community as well.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for your time, Matty, and that was incredible. Lots of tips, and I wish you all the success in all your books, which are going to come out of you, I'm sure, from your creative mind, and also the way how you actually conduct your day, which is incredible. So thank you.
Thank you. This has been so much fun. I've loved your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, and we will speak soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.